Sylvester Stallone collapses on live TV, leaving the audience in shock. The event is unexpected and happens during a seemingly lighthearted interview. Viewers are left wondering why a tough guy like him broke down in front of millions. The camera zoomed in as the audience erupted into applause. The host, Jason Miller, flashed a wide grin as he greeted his guest for the night, the legendary Sylvester Stallone. The action star, known for his role in Rocky and Rambo, sauntered on stage with that unmistakable swagger. Muscles rippling, a grin plastered across his face, as if the world had nothing on him. Jason clapped him on the back. "Sly, it's an honor, my man. Always a pleasure to have you here." Stallone smiled back, his trademark charm in full force. "Thanks, Jason. Great to be here." The audience cheered, hooting and hollering. This was the moment they had been waiting for, a live TV appearance from one of Hollywood's biggest icons. No one could have expected what was about to happen next. "So," Jason began, settling into the smooth rhythm of their usual banter, "let's talk about Rocky for a second. You know, every time that movie airs, people can't help but talk about how you wrote and directed it yourself. What a crazy ride that must have been. But tell me, Sly, when you were writing that script, were you running on pure inspiration, or was there someone, driving you personally?" Stallone's face tightened for just a second, barely noticeable, but it was there. He let out a short, almost forced laugh. "Oh, just a lot of late nights and coffee." Jason leaned in, sensing a chance to dig deeper. "Well, I know everyone wants to hear about the big hits, but what I'm talking about is the real stuff, the deep stuff. Like, people don't realize how much of your personal life made it onto that screen. But not just the Rocky stuff. Tell me, Sly, what was going on back then? What was really driving you?" A chill ran through the air. The studio lights felt a bit brighter all of a sudden. Stallone's smile faltered. His jaw tensed, his eyes darting around the room for a second before locking on Jason. "Well, that's a long time ago, man. It's all in the past. A lot of water under the bridge." But Jason wasn't letting it go. "Yeah, but sometimes the past is what shapes you the most, right? I know there's that part of you that keeps it locked up, but come on. There was someone back then, wasn't there? Someone really close to you, who you haven't talked about in years. I've read a little about your family, Sly. Your brother Frank. You've never said much about him, have you?" The word Frank hit like a sucker punch. Stallone's expression shifted so slightly, the audience almost missed it, but Jason didn't. He caught the flicker of discomfort, the brief pause before Sly's famous grin returned. I don't know what you mean, Jason." Stallone chuckled, his voice suddenly thick. "Family's complicated, man. You know how it is." But the damage was done. The audience sensed it, a murmur rippling through the crowd as they leaned in, trying to make sense of the sudden shift. This wasn't the same Stallone they were used to, the confident, untouchable star. The tension was palpable. Jason pushed again, but this time he was careful. "But it's not just the fame, right? There's more to it, isn't there? You don't just go from that kid in Philly to this icon without some serious family drama. And I heard you never really reconciled, did you? You and Frank. What happened, Sly?" For just a heartbeat, Stallone's poker face cracked. His eyes dropped to the floor, his jaw clenched. It was brief, only a fraction of a second, but it told the audience everything they needed to know. The camera zoomed in, catching the subtle shift in Stallone's demeanor. The audience was suddenly aware that there was something much heavier behind those eyes than they had ever imagined. The mood in the studio had shifted. The playful energy from the earlier part of the interview had drained, leaving a charged silence hanging between Jason and Stallone. The audience, now leaning forward, could feel the tension in the air. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath. Jason didn't let up. Sly, people think they know you because of Rocky or Rambo, but there's a lot more to you than just those iconic roles. We've seen the tough guy, but tonight I think people want to know about the man behind the screen. The real story, right?" Stallone shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing briefly at the audience before focusing back on Jason. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Look, I've been around for a long time. A lot of people think they know me. But you get to a point where you realize some things are better left forgotten. The words hit like a bombshell, a quiet echo in the studio. The audience stayed still, unsure how to react. Jason, sensing Stallone's discomfort, but also knowing this was a rare chance, pressed on. But sometimes, Sly, the things we want to forget are exactly what define us. What we can't let go of, you know? And if you don't mind me saying, I think there's something about your past that still sticks with you. Something you carry with you every day. Stallone's face tightened again, the muscles in his neck visible as he held himself in check. His eyes flickered for a moment, betraying the calm he was trying to maintain. I said it's in the past, he repeated, his voice a little sharper now. No need to drag it all out again. Jason's expression softened slightly, but his curiosity only deepened. Hey, I'm just trying to understand you better. But okay, let me ask you this. You were always the guy in those movies, right? The one who never backed down. But off camera, was it always that easy? Was it always just you, or was there someone helping you get through it all? I know you had some family trouble back then, and there's been a lot of speculation about it. Can you share more about that? Stallone's body stiffened, his chest rising and falling a little quicker now. He shifted in his seat, clearly battling his emotions. The audience, sensing the change, became eerily silent. Jason wasn't backing down. People remember the big movies, the fights, the triumphs. But what about the personal stuff? Was there anyone you leaned on when the cameras stopped rolling? Someone close to you who saw all the stuff we didn't get to see? For a brief moment, Stallone seemed to retreat inward, his eyes losing focus. The ghost of something, someone, hovered just out of view. He swallowed hard, blinking as if fighting back tears. And then, without warning, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, there was someone. A lot of people, actually. But it wasn't always the ones you expect. It wasn't the fame or the fortune that helped me keep going. It was... He trailed off, his eyes darting to the side as if searching for something. Something that wasn't there. The room grew colder, and the audience felt it. The tension between the host and the guest had turned personal, deep, and uncomfortably raw. Jason leaned in again, this time with real concern. You don't have to talk about it, Sly. But we're all curious. People want to know what makes you tick. What made you keep fighting, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart? Stallone's gaze met his. A flash of something, vulnerability, pain, flashed in his eyes before he quickly masked it. It was my family, and I'm not proud of how things went down. But I can't change it. We all have scars. Jason held his gaze for a beat, nodding slowly, sensing that he was standing on the edge of something monumental. Family is complicated, isn't it? Stallone's face tightened again, this time in a way that made the audience hold their breath. The walls were coming down, but just as quickly he seemed to pull them back up. His posture stiffened once more, and the familiar tough guy mask slid back into place. The silence was deafening, but Jason wasn't about to let it go. You don't have to say it now, but what happened to your brother, Sly? What went wrong between you two? The question hung in the air like a time bomb, waiting to explode. Stallone's eyes locked onto Jason's, his expression suddenly more guarded than before. The room seemed to close in, the weight of the question heavy between them. The audience could feel the shift. What had once been a casual, late-night chat was now a confrontation of sorts, raw and unfiltered. Jason, sensing he'd hit a nerve, wasn't about to back off. I know it's tough, Sly, he said, his voice softer now. But people want to know. Your fans, the people who followed you for decades, they're curious about the real you, not just the movie star, the action hero. Stallone shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair. The silence dragged on for what felt like an eternity, the entire room waiting for him to say something, anything. Finally, Stallone broke it. It's not something I like to talk about, he muttered, his voice low and almost inaudible. You don't understand what it's like to lose someone close to you. Not just lose them. Watch them drift away, like they're slipping through your fingers, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Jason leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. What happened, Sly? What went wrong between you and Frank? He was your brother. Your flesh and blood. What drove the wedge between you two? For a moment, Stallone's eyes flickered with something deep, something that felt like sorrow, or maybe guilt. He swallowed hard, a muscle in his jaw twitching. He was always there for me when I was starting out, Stallone said, his voice cracking slightly. When no one believed in me, when I was just a kid trying to make it in Hollywood, it was Frank who had my back. He was my rock. But then things started to change. People change. Life gets in the way, you know. Jason's face softened as he saw the raw emotion in Stallone's eyes. It's tough, man. It sounds like you two went through a lot together. Stallone gave a sharp nod. Yeah, we did. But there comes a point when you realize some people can't be saved, and some things are better left in the past. His voice trailed off, but the tension in the room only grew. But Jason wasn't ready to let it go. But why the distance, Sly? What happened that you can't reconcile? Why did you and Frank fall apart? A long pause. Then Stallone's expression darkened. He stared at the floor, his lips pressed tightly together. It wasn't just family issues. It was bigger than that. Frank had his demons. We both did. But his were darker. He made choices that destroyed everything we had, and I couldn't follow him down that road. I tried, but it wasn't enough. Jason, now realizing he was diving into a much deeper wound than he had anticipated, softened his tone. Do you think there's any chance for reconciliation? Do you think you two could ever find your way back to each other? Stallone's eyes flashed with a sudden intensity. He shook his head slowly. I don't know. It's hard to say. We've been through too much, too many years of bitterness. I've tried, but sometimes people are too far gone to save. The host fell silent for a moment, unsure how to proceed. The rawness of the conversation had shifted the dynamic. What had started as a playful chat about movies was now something deeply personal, something Stallone clearly wasn't prepared to unpack. Okay, well, Jason said after a long pause, trying to steer things back to a lighter note. We don't have to go any further if you don't want to. But man, that's heavy. I didn't realize the depth of it all. Stallone gave a brief, tight-lipped smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, well, sometimes life's heavier than the movies. The audience remained quiet, hanging on to every word, every shift in Stallone's mood. His guard was up again, the old tough guy facade slowly sliding back into place. But something in his eyes, a flicker of pain, lingered. The mask was still cracked, and they all saw it. Jason, sensing the conversation had reached its limit, quickly changed the subject, though the mood had already shifted. All right, let's talk about your upcoming project. I know you've been working on something new, right? Stallone nodded, visibly relieved at the change of direction. Yeah, it's a new film. Something completely different. I'm really excited about it. Jason nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The conversation had hit a nerve, and even though Stallone had closed off, the unease was clear. The audience couldn't help but wonder, what was really going on behind the scenes? Why did the mention of his brother cause such a reaction? And then, just as the conversation seemed to find its groove again, something unexpected happened. Stallone's demeanor shifted again, this time in a way no one could have anticipated. His face went pale, his eyes unfocused, as if something in the room had triggered a flood of memories. For a split second, it looked like he was about to say something deep, something personal, before he quickly gathered himself and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension had only deepened, and the audience held their breath, knowing that whatever was coming next might just be more than they could handle. The studio lights seemed to burn a little brighter now, casting long shadows across Stallone's face. The tension in the room was palpable. Even the audience felt the weight of the conversation that had just unfolded. They had come for a fun late-night chat with a movie icon, but now they were witnessing something much deeper. A man on the edge of exposing more than he had ever intended. Jason, ever the pro, tried to keep the show moving, but the air had thickened. All right, Sly, let's shift gears here. I know the audience is dying to hear about your next project. You've got a lot of buzz surrounding it. What can you tell us about it? Stallone took a moment, blinking as if coming back to the present. He cleared his throat, the tightness in his voice still evident. Yeah, it's something I've been working on for a while. It's not your typical action film, though. This one's Personal. It's something I've wanted to do for years. Jason nodded, sensing a slight hesitation. Sounds intriguing. Personal? In what way? Stallone leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the right words. It's about facing the past, confronting demons, not just in a physical sense like you'd see in Rocky or Rambo, but emotional stuff. Things we bury deep inside because we're afraid of what's on the other side. Jason couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in Stallone's voice. Softer, more introspective. It was clear this film was more than just a project for him. It was an outlet for something much bigger. Something that had been weighing on him for years. I think people will be surprised, Stallone continued. But that's kind of the point. It's not just about the fights or the big explosions. It's about the fight inside yourself. Jason sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he picked up on the undertone in Stallone's words. It sounds like you're pulling from some real-life experience. You know, you mentioned facing demons. You've had your share of those, haven't you, Sly? Your brother Frank, your family. The words were like a spark to dry tinder. Stallone's face shifted again, the guard coming down just slightly. His eyes flickered for a second, then he quickly looked away, as if avoiding something or someone in the audience. His chest rose and fell faster now, a sign of mounting frustration. Listen, Jason, Stallone said, his voice becoming more clipped. It's not easy talking about all this. I've been running from it for a long time. But what happened with Frank? It's a lot more complicated than you think. It's not just a simple family fight or some kind of disagreement. It's like a part of me died when that relationship broke down. Jason watched him carefully. The tough guy image Stallone had perfected over the years was slipping, and what was left in its place was a man who was no longer sure if he could hold back the flood of emotions threatening to break free. Before Jason could respond, Stallone suddenly stood up, brushing his hand across his face. I can't do this anymore, he muttered under his breath. The audience went silent. The shift was so sudden that it sent a ripple through the room. Stallone turned toward the edge of the stage, pacing a few steps before halting in his tracks, his back to the camera. The host looked around nervously, unsure of what to do. The crew, sensing the tension, started whispering in the background. Jason's voice softened. Sly, it's okay. You don't have to go there if you don't want to. But hey, if you're not feeling all right, we can take a breather, you know? Get some air. We'll be here when you're ready. The camera zoomed in on Stallone's back. He was stiff, his shoulders taut as if holding back a torrent of something. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had gone still. Just give me a second, Stallone said, his voice barely above a whisper. His words seemed to carry more weight now, the kind of weight that didn't belong on a Hollywood star. The crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, held their collective breath. Jason nodded. Take your time, man. We're here. Stallone took a few deep breaths, his hands balled into fists. The moment stretched on longer than expected. Was he about to break down right here, on live TV? The thought lingered in the air, thick with anticipation. Then in a sudden move, Stallone turned back around and gave a half smile, though it was clear the smile didn't reach his eyes. Sorry about that. Just needed to gather my thoughts. The audience, relieved that he was back, cheered lightly. But the mood had changed. Stallone wasn't the same man who had walked onto the stage just an hour ago. There was something deeper going on, something more fragile beneath the surface. Jason, sensing the shift, quickly moved the conversation along. No worries, Sly. So let's talk about how you've been handling life lately. You've got a lot of projects going on, and you've been doing some serious reflection, right? What's next for you? But as the words left his mouth, something in Stallone's eyes told him that they hadn't reached the end of this conversation yet, and whatever was coming next would be far more than anyone had anticipated. Stallone settled back into his chair, though it was clear that he hadn't fully returned to the persona the audience was used to seeing. He was visibly shaken, the cracks in his tough guy exterior becoming more apparent with every passing minute. Jason, sensing the shift, didn't push too hard this time. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking, as though giving Stallone room to breathe. So, Sly, Jason began, his voice quieter now. You've been through a lot. We've talked about your family, your brother, and I can see it's not easy for you. But we've also seen you bounce back from tough situations. Time and again, you've risen from the ashes, both in your career and your personal life. How do you do it? What keeps you going when things get dark?" Stallone let out a long breath, his shoulders sinking a bit, as if the weight of the conversation had taken its toll. "You just keep moving forward, Jason. Even when everything inside you says to stop, you push through. That's what I learned. I had to learn it the hard way." Jason nodded, sensing the genuine emotion behind Stallone's words. "And what about your brother, Frank? You said things were complicated. You said he had his demons. What happened to him? Is he okay?" At the mention of Frank's name, Stallone's body language shifted again. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists, knuckles white against his skin. He looked away, his eyes scanning the stage as though searching for an escape. He's not the person he used to be, Jason," Stallone said, his voice thick with regret. "I tried to help him. God knows I did. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't change someone. They have to want to change themselves." Jason leaned forward, sensing the story was about to take a dark turn. "What do you mean by that? What happened to him, Sly? Why did you two drift so far apart?" Stallone's gaze softened for a moment, as if the floodgates were about to open. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "It wasn't just about us growing apart. It was, it was the choices Frank made. He got into some bad stuff, things I can't even talk about. I knew he was struggling, but I didn't know how deep it went. And by the time I realized, it was too late." The audience fell into a hushed silence. No one had expected this, a raw, unfiltered look at the pain that had been buried for so long. Jason's eyes softened as he processed the weight of Stallone's words. Did he ever reach out for help?" Jason asked carefully, his voice barely above a whisper. Stallone nodded slowly, the pain in his eyes unmistakable. "Yeah, he did. But it wasn't the kind of help that could fix him, you know? It was too late by then. I tried to save him, but you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." The audience was on edge, no one daring to speak. It felt like a private moment, one that wasn't meant to be shared with millions of people. Yet there Stallone was, sharing the deepest part of himself with the world. Jason, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, shifted the conversation again. "And what about you, Sly? What did all of this do to you? You're one of the strongest people out there. But I can see that this still eats at you." Stallone's gaze hardened. "It tore me up, Jason. It still does. Every day. But I can't let it ruin me. I can't let it define me. I had to learn to live with the pain. You can't run from your past forever. So, you just have to make peace with it." Jason gave him a nod of understanding. "I get it. But the thing is, you're still here, man. You're still fighting. And that's what makes you who you are. You've faced your demons and come out the other side. That takes strength." Stallone didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered for a moment, as if weighing the truth of Jason's words. "I don't feel strong, Jason," he said quietly. "Sometimes I just feel like I'm barely hanging on. But then I think about all the people who've supported me. And I remember that it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up. Even when it hurts." Jason, moved by the raw honesty in Stallone's voice, decided to ask one last question. "Do you think you and Frank will ever make amends? Is there hope for reconciliation?" Stallone's face tightened, his eyes hardening for just a moment. "I don't know. I can't say. I've tried. But sometimes people, they're just too far gone. I've learned to accept that, but I'll always wonder what could have been. Always." The silence between them was heavy. The audience could feel the finality in Stallone's words, the lingering sense of something unresolved, something that could never fully heal. It was clear, this was a man who had been carrying an enormous burden for years, and just as the weight of the conversation seemed to settle in, something shifted. Stallone's face twitched, his hands shaking ever so slightly as he gripped the armrest of his chair. His expression turned darker, more distant, as if something had triggered another deep, buried memory. Jason noticed it immediately. "Sly?" he said gently. "Are you all right?" Stallone didn't answer. He just sat there, his eyes far away as if he were lost in thought, somewhere between the past and the present. The audience watched in stunned silence, unsure what was happening or where the interview would go next. And then, without warning, Stallone slowly stood up, his legs wobbling slightly before turning to walk off stage. His eyes remained fixed on the floor as if he couldn't face the world for just one more moment. "Sorry, man," he muttered, his voice barely audible, before disappearing behind the curtains. The camera cut to Jason, who stared after him, speechless. The audience, just as stunned, was left to wonder what had just happened. The backstage area was buzzing with frantic energy. Crew members were running around whispering to each other, unsure of what to do next. The sudden exit of Sylvester Stallone had thrown everything off script. Jason, standing at the front of the stage, could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. The audience, still reeling from the emotional conversation, sat in stunned silence, unsure if this was part of the show or something much more serious. A few seconds passed before Jason grabbed the mic, trying to regain control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to take a short break," he said, his voice strained, trying to cover up the tension. "We'll be back shortly." The audience didn't seem to know how to react. Were they part of some kind of spectacle, or was this real? The camera zoomed out, showing the confusion on the crew's faces. Jason stood in the spotlight, now just as uncertain as everyone else. Behind the curtains, Stallone leaned against a wall, his breathing heavy, his body trembling. For a moment, it looked like he was about to collapse. His face was pale, sweat dotted his forehead, and his hands gripped the edge of a nearby table. He looked like a man who had just run out of options, like he had been fighting a battle with himself and had finally reached the breaking point. A few crew members approached him cautiously, unsure of how to handle the situation. One of them, a producer named Carla, stepped forward and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sly, we need to get you to a doctor," she said, her voice full of concern. "You're not looking well. You've been under a lot of stress, man." Stallone barely responded, his eyes distant, unfocused. He shook his head as if trying to shake off the overwhelming weight that had taken hold of him. I can't go back out there," he muttered. "Hey, listen to me," Carla continued. "You're not doing this alone. We're here for you. But you need help, Sly. Just a little more time, all right?" But Stallone's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't hearing her. His thoughts were consumed by something far more personal, something he had avoided confronting for years. A shadow from his past had just been dragged into the light, and now he couldn't escape it. Not here, not now. Back on stage, Jason was still talking to the audience, his eyes glancing nervously toward the backstage area. The tension had reached its peak, and no one knew how this would end. Minutes passed, and finally Stallone reappeared. But this time, he wasn't the same man who had walked onto the stage just an hour ago. His eyes were red, his face drained of color. He looked like a man who had been through something so profound, so personal, that it had shaken him to his core. He took a deep breath before stepping back into the spotlight. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, sat in complete silence. No applause, no cheers, just a room full of people watching, waiting. Jason stood up, unsure of how to proceed, but Stallone held up a hand to stop him. "I need to say something," Stallone said, his voice unsteady but determined. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, taking a moment to collect himself. "Jason, I've been running from this my whole life," he began, his eyes locking onto the camera. "From the pain, from the loss, from the mistakes I've made. But tonight I can't keep pretending. The thing with Frank, it's not just about a broken relationship or a family issue. It's about the guilt, the feeling that I could have done more, that I should have done more, but I didn't." He paused, his voice cracking. "And that's something I've carried with me for years. And I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I can." Jason stood quietly, giving Stallone the space to speak. The audience sat in complete silence, hanging on every word. "But what I can do," Stallone continued, "is be real. I can stop pretending like everything's okay. I can admit that I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. But I'm here, still standing. Still trying, and that's all I can give. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Stallone's shoulders slumped, and for the first time all night, his mask of toughness completely slipped away. He wasn't the action hero or the Hollywood icon anymore. He was just a man who had faced his demons, and for the first time in years, he was ready to confront them. Jason stepped forward slowly, his voice softer now. You don't have to do this alone, Sly. You've got people who care about you, and you've got a world full of fans who love you, no matter what. Stallone nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. Yeah, he whispered. I know, I've never really felt that before. For a moment, it looked like Stallone was going to break down right there, in front of millions of people. But instead, he took a deep breath and forced a small smile. It was shaky, but it was there. Thank you, Jason, he said quietly. Thank you for letting me be real for once. Jason smiled back. Anytime, Sly. Anytime. And with that, Stallone turned slowly and walked off stage, leaving the audience in a stunned silence. The camera lingered on the empty stage for a moment, capturing the raw emotion that had unfolded. As the show's credits began to roll, no one in the audience knew what to think. They had just witnessed something they would never forget, something far more real than anything Hollywood could ever produce. The screen faded to black.